Our next witness would be known as Ms. Q. She is anonymous. Most of you, I think probably all of you, were here this morning when I described what anonymity meant, so I don't need to go through that again, do I? Let me just, however, read the order. The order is that the name and address of witness W1234, that's memorable, Miss Q, to you and me, the surname of her husband who died, and any other identifying information, such as the witness's image or a description of their appearance, cannot be disclosed or published in any form unless express permission is given by me or by the solicitor to the inquiry acting on my behalf. Witness 1234 must be referred to only as Ms. Q. The order remains in force for the duration of the inquiry and at all times thereafter, unless otherwise ordered, and I may vary or revoke the order by making a further order during the course of the inquiry. That's what I order. Ms. Q.
And repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Ms. Q, you're here to give evidence about your late husband.
Yes.
And you're going to refer to him by his first name, which was David.
Yes.
And that information will be public, but the remainder of information about your identity and his will not be.
Thank you.
And you've provided us with a photograph of David, which for obvious reasons won't go on the screen, but you've provided it so that Sir Brian and I can see who he was and that he was a real person, in your words.
I have seen it. Thank you.
You and David met at school at the age of about 15 or 16.
Yes, we did.
And you married in 1981.
We did.
And he had haemophilia A, but it was very mild.
Yes, he wasn't diagnosed properly until he was 16.
When he was 4 years old, he had an accident and fractured his skull and had surgery of some form or another.
Yeah, he had two craniotomies, one at the front of his head and one at the back.
And he didn't require any treatment for his haemophilia?
No, none at all.
He used to play rugby?
Yes, he was a prop forward.
And so, as you say, he lived his childhood without experiencing any difficulties in relation to his very mild haemophilia?
None at all.
Now, in August of 1978, he was referred by a dentist to Manchester Royal Infirmary for a tooth extraction.
That's right. In 1976, he'd had a rugby injury and he'd had a very bad bruise to his thigh. And the GP at the time sent him to Manchester Royal to find out why he'd bruised so badly. And they had decided then that he was haemophiliac. So by 1978, they weren't going to risk a tooth extraction, and they sent him to Manchester Royal.
But you've said in your statement, at that stage of his life, he'd never even spoken to a haemophilia doctor.
No, never seen one or anything.
And then what happened in terms of his treatment?
He went in, he had factor VIII, nothing was discussed or no information at all. Had his tooth extraction, was astonished that he hadn't bled and carried on as normal.
And you've said in your statement, no one told you and David what the injection was.
No, not a clue.
That was the first time he received factor VIII, and no information was given?
None.
And certainly no advice or warnings about any risk of infection? Was there any discussion with David about any alternatives
None
to
at
factor
all.
VIII?
No.
Now, he didn't see a haematologist again until 1981,
That's right.
when he was seen because he was going to undergo some form of eye surgery.
Yeah, yeah.
And what happened then?
He wasn't seen by the haemophilia doctors at all. He was admitted to Manchester Eye Hospital, and I was at work. When I went to visit him in the evening, he had a drip up, which, to be honest, put the fear of heavens in me. They'd given him some factor 8, which we found out later, and he was infused again whilst I was there, and then he had to go every day for 2 weeks afterwards to have more factor 8, which seemed an awful lot, because his factor level was 15%.
And you've said in your statement he was given factor 8 on that occasion before and after the surgery.
Yeah.
He was given it for a week in hospital afterwards, and then he was given it, he had to go back to
every
his
day.
home in hospital for a further week, so the 2 weeks afterwards. Again, on that occasion, was any advice or information or warnings given about any risks of infection?
No, none.
Or any discussion about alternatives?
No. I don't think he even saw a haemophilia doctor before he actually went down for surgery, and I think it was the house officer who was covering the wards that gave him the factor 8.
Now, he had an immediate reaction on that occasion on returning home. What was
Yeah,
the
he was really, really poorly. He was raging fevers, passing... they thought he had a urinary infection because he had so much pain in his back and in his kidneys. And he lost loads of weight. He lost at least two stone in just a few weeks. And like I say, the GP said it was a urine infection. His mum actually, ironically, said it's that damn stuff they gave him. To which I said, no, it can't possibly have been. How wrong was I?
You've observed that although David was a very mild haemophiliac, there are references in his notes and records to him being a moderate or moderately severe or severe haemophiliac.
Yes, yeah.
And you have a fear that perhaps they'd mixed him up and he was simply given the treatment unnecessarily.
Yes, I do. I still to this day believe that it always seemed a bit odd to me that he had so much treatment post-op and that they'd muddled him up with somebody else, and that's why he was given, such a long course of treatment.
Now, he wasn't seen again for his haemophilia between that time and 1985.
No.
And then in August 1985, he received a letter saying he might have been infected with HTLV3 and to come and be tested. What can you recall about that?
I remember we'd not long since had a baby, and he showed me the letter and he said, "Good, what's HTLV3 for a start?" So I said, "I think it's, the AIDS virus." And he said, "Well, that can't be. I've only had it, once. How can it twice? How can it be?" So I said, "Well, you'll have to go." But I had the little one, so I couldn't go with him. So he went to the hospital on his own and had the blood test and came home.
And then you got a letter?
And then we got a letter to say, "Come back, we've got the results now."
And you went with him to that appointment?
Absolutely, yes.
And you saw Dr. Wensley?
Yes.
30th of August 1985?
Yeah.
And what can you remember about that appointment?
We walked in, we sat down, he said, "It looks like we've given you the AIDS virus. Don't share your toothbrushes, don't share comb, don't share a hairbrush, and don't have any children."
What was your family situation at the time?
I had a 4-month-old and a 20-month-old.
And you were told that you and the children would have to be tested?
Yes.
What was David told about prognosis?
2 years.
And what was he told in terms of coming back for a follow-up appointment?
Turn up again in 6 months.
And what about telling other people? What were you
Oh,
told about that?
absolutely, do not tell anyone. They would count the number of people that we told. He mustn't tell a soul.
And I should say the concerns you've expressed about those matters have been put to Dr. Wensley, and a response is awaited and will be published in due course if received. So. You were tested there and then.
Yes.
Was any counselling or discussion taking place about it?
It was just like it was normal routine blood tests that they did on everybody, and that was it.
And then an appointment was made for you to take the children to Pendlebury Children's Hospital.
Yes.
How was that?
That was horrendous. Having to hold down 2 small children while they took blood from them, wondering whether or not they had a life-threatening disease. It was just awful.
David phoned the hospital for the test results in relation to the children and was told, fortunately, that they were negative.
Yes.
He was also told your results over the phone.
Yes, he was.
Also negative,
Yes,
but you've described a clear breach of confidentiality.
absolutely. That was my test result, not David's test result. If, God forbid, if that test had come back positive, he would have been even more destroyed and distraught than he was.
You were advised by Dr. Wensley to be retested every 6 months, but you declined. Why was that?
Because David had gone through enough pain and enough angst, worrying about the first lot of testing. And I just couldn't bear to have been tested every 6 months, because he would have known I'd been tested and he would have wanted to know the results. So if I wasn't tested, I wouldn't have to tell him the results.
And you were a young married couple with a very young family. What was the impact on you and on David of this news?
Well, we were thankful that I was negative and the children were negative, but for him it was just destroying, utterly destroying. I remember he was sitting in the bath, and I was, like you do, sitting on the loo talking, and he said, I just don't want to go on anymore.
And you've said in your statement he was already at that early stage distraught.
Absolutely.
A shadow of the man he used to be.
Yeah.
And you weren't willing to put him through the possibility of having to find out that he'd infected you.
That's right.
Now, you've expressed the belief in your witness statement that he might have been tested for purposes of research.
Yes.
What was at the time you wrote your statement, first of all, what's the basis for that belief?
In the UK HCDO records, his date of first positive is a month previous to him being recalled. I don't know where they've got that blood from, but it must have been stored and tested. So they knew he was positive before they even sent the letter.
And you've very recently obtained a document, I think it arrived yesterday,
Yes.
from UK HCDO, which, and we haven't had time to get it scanned and put on the system, but it has a medical research number in it, is
Yes,
that right?
it does, yes.
And what concerns you in particular about that?
When I've unravelled the codes on it, this is a document that was produced 10 months after he died, a medical research document that was produced 10 months after he died. They were still trying to research what was going on 10 months after he died. When they couldn't produce his medical records for the coroner.
And you've also identified from your consideration of his records that he had been tested for hepatitis B,
Yes.
and you don't think he consented to
No,
that? Or
definitely
knew
not.
anything about it?
No. In fact, hepatitis B had never, ever been discussed with us.
Now, at this time, David was working, and won't go into precise details about his career because of the anonymity, but he was working in a scientific capacity
Yes.
in a job that he loved.
Yes.
And as part of it, he had to have blood tests every 3 months.
Yes.
And that gave rise to a dilemma for him. What
Yes.
was that dilemma?
He was frightened that he couldn't disclose his infection and he would put the nurses at risk taking his blood. So he resigned from the job and took up, and it was a well-paid job with a very good prospect and a handsome pension. And he just couldn't put them at risk, so he resigned and became a salesman.
And he felt he couldn't tell them of his condition, the nurses at work who take the bloods for the testing, because of the stigma.
Absolutely.
You've said in your statement this was the time of the terrifying adverts on TV.
Yeah, this was a Tombstones time.
And you'd been told at the point at which he was given the diagnosis not to tell anyone.
Yes.
So he gave up the job he loved and took up a job which, from what you've said in his statement, he didn't love.
He did it, and he was very good at it, but he didn't enjoy it like he had done being in the lab.
And it was a very tiring job, his new sales job,
Yeah.
because it involved an awful lot of travelling.
An awful lot of travel.
And at this point, you went back to work
Yes.
a couple of nights a week.
I was doing 2 nights a week, split nights, because I didn't have anybody to look after the children, so I would stay up. You know, I'd do one night and then I'd stay up with them, then I'd sleep the next night, stay up with them and then work the following night, so.
And that was as a nurse.
As a nurse, yeah.
By September of the following year, 1986, you described him as a mere shell of the man you married.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about how he was?
He was distant. He wouldn't talk about things. He was distant with the children. He didn't want to hug them and he was terrified if they went in the bathroom without him, you know, watching what they were doing, and he was just broken, really broken. Psychologically, he was shattered.
Mentally in bits, you
Yeah.
described him in your statement. And it was, at that stage, it wasn't so much the physical ill health, but the diagnosis itself and the fear that
Yes.
was destroying him.
Absolutely.
By 1988, his CD4 count was beginning to drop.
Yes. We had an incident where David had gone for his 6 monthly checkup, and Dr. Wensley sat there and said that his CD4 count had become low, and had he thought about going on the Concord trial? To which I said, hang on a minute, if he needs AZT, he needs AZT. He doesn't need a trial where he could get a placebo, he needs the drug. And he sort of looked at me a bit shocked, and then he said, oh, right, well, we'll just do some more blood tests. And they kept us waiting for hours and hours. And the CD4 count came back, and he said, oh, miraculously, it's raised, so we don't need to worry about AZT.
David did start on AZT the following year, 1989.
Yes.
And you said in your statement he initially tolerated that reasonably well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, as Richard said, it's a constant reminder every time you take it.
But then he started to suffer abdominal pains, weight loss, loss of
Absolutely.
appetite and depression.
Yes.
And there came a point in time at which his liver and spleen were discovered to be enlarged.
Yes.
And then in December 1990, he was told that he might have contracted hepatitis C.
Yes, they went through a bit of a rigmarole to start with. They blamed the AZT. They wanted to stop that because they thought it was that had caused the problem. It'd been put on antidepressants by this time, and they wanted to stop them because they thought that had caused the liver problems. And then they said it might be non-A, non-B at that time.
His AZT was stopped and he was told he might need a liver biopsy.
Yes.
And indeed told that he would need factor VIII.
Yes.
And what were you told about how he could obtain factor VIII?
They said that they had some, there was, obviously he said no to factor VIII, that wasn't happening. And they said, oh, well, we've got this really high specification stuff, this really high purity. We reserve it for children, and if you want it, we can't prescribe it, so it's £30,000.
Something you simply couldn't have.
No.
And then there was some rigmarole surrounding the biopsy itself. You received a call to tell you it had been cancelled.
Yeah, for a year they'd been saying that he needed a biopsy. And by this time it was Dr. Lucas was in charge of the haemophilia centre, and between the hepatologist and the haemophilia centre there was a lot of hooing and hawing whether they could fit everybody in. Anyway, the night before, 5 o'clock, the night before the biopsy, by which time you've arranged childcare, you've arranged dog sitter, the whole thing, to say that it had been cancelled. I wasn't very happy. And I said, how come it's cancelled? And they said that we haven't got a protocol for treating this sort of patient.
Do you know what was meant by that?
Well, I assumed that he meant if David was positive, they didn't know what they could do about it. But my thought was, well, if we haven't got a diagnosis, why are we worrying about treatment when we don't know what the problem is? So I did threaten the consultant, who then rang me back at 7 o'clock to say that the biopsy was on and everything would be well.
She said you'd happily go to the hospital and blow up the lot of them.
Yes.
You were angry.
Oh, very. I was absolutely furious.
And it was after that liver biopsy that it was confirmed that David did indeed have chronic active hepatitis,
Yes.
hepatitis C.
Yes. There was an ELSA test around that time, and it was positive for hepatitis C.
Now, it was in early 1992 that David was then seen by a doctor called Dr. McClendon.
Yes.
And you've said he was a doctor who finally sat down with you and told you everything you felt you needed to know.
Yeah, he was absolutely amazing. He sat us down, he went through everything he went through. He talked to us like we were adult human beings who could understand. We weren't being treated like small children. He was just amazing, absolutely.
And he told you that non-A, non-B was now known as hepatitis C.
Yes.
He was honest with you that they were uncertain about the management of the condition.
Yep.
He told you particular potential difficulties because of the combination of David's HIV and hepatitis C.
Yes.
Again, I think in that same year, David was started on Septrin. Is that right?
Yes. He'd been on the AZT, but the haemophilia centre hadn't bothered to put him on any prophylaxis for pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, and it was practice to put them on prophylaxis at the same time as starting antiretroviral drugs. So by this time, they'd started doing joint clinics with a HIV specialist, and he started David on Septrin. They started David on Septrin. Unfortunately, David was violently allergic to Septrin, and he ended up with Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which is where basically you shed all your mucous membranes. So his mouth, itchy rash everywhere. His mouth was completely raw. He was in a mess.
And he was admitted to hospital, and you've described the nursing care at that time
Dire.
as appalling.
Yeah, absolutely diabolical.
And in what way?
He was hallucinating because his temperature was that high. He was left in a bed. He was given 3 cotton wool bobs and a bottle of calamine lotion to cover himself in calamine, but he couldn't reach his back. He wasn't helped to have a wash. He was in there, it must have been nearly a week, never had a wash. Nobody would go near him.
And do you think that was because of the HIV?
Yes, I think so.
He then embarked upon interferon treatment in
Yes.
1992, and again he was admitted to hospital for that.
Yes,
because
he
of the
was.
potential side effects.
Yeah, because of the potential side effects, they decided that they would take him in. And he sat there for, I think it was about 48 hours he was in, and waited for these dreadful side effects, of which he had none. And it wasn't till some distance down the line that he actually started getting the flu-like symptoms and all the other side effects that people get with interferon.
And there was even some debate about whose responsibility it was going to be to fund the treatment, the hospital or trusts or the GP.
Yeah, basically they said that, and I think this was going back to the liver biopsy, I think this was what was probably at the root of it. They didn't know who was going to pay. And in the end, we were asked to go and see our GP and ask our GP if they would pay for David's interferon.
Now, in 1993, David had another liver biopsy. This time he was given DDAVP.
Yep.
And you've said there that the treatment was an absolute disgrace.
Yes.
Again, in what way?
It's just, they can't, the nurse that was giving the DDAVP couldn't even set the drip rate on the IV. She couldn't calculate how many drips a minute it was supposed to run in over. She was supposed to be doing observations every 5 minutes to start with, but she couldn't do that. So in the end, I took over running the drip and doing his obs and making sure he was comfortable. And then he went down for the biopsy after that.
And that biopsy confirmed that the interferon had not had any effect?
No effect at all.
David was also having to undergo various different permutations of medication for his HIV.
Yes.
Some of which had a very bad effect on him.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that?
He became really, really aggressive for the first time, and he was a very proud man, a real man's man. He it was quite old-fashioned. The woman's place was in the home, preferably tied to the kitchen. But he was very old-fashioned about that, and I've lost my thread. I'm sorry.
You said he became really aggressive.
Yeah,
on one of
he'd
the
never
trips.
ever raised his hand to me, but he did then, and one of the children became he lost his temper with him and got hold of him.
And you've described that process of medication with all these different drugs having to be taken at different times and different intervals as an exhausting, relentless process.
Yes. It was like being back in nursing doing a drug round, but it was a drug round every hour because the combinations then were very different because they were all very, very new drugs. So some were with food, some were without food, some were after food, some were before food, some were, every so many hours, and you wake up in the night to take them as well. And it was a full-time job just managing. Oh, and some you could eat certain foods with as well. So it was managing that whole drug regime was hard work.
And by 1995, in terms of David's physical condition, he was complaining of polydipsia and polyuria.
Yes.
He had no appetite.
Nope.
But he had to try with a high-calorie diet to maintain his weight.
Yes, they put him on. They put him for his liver because his liver was causing issues. they put him on a high-calorie, low-fat diet to try and keep his weight up, which exacerbated the polydipsia and polyuria. And when we went to the haemophilia joint clinic, they took bloods like they always did and failed to notice that his blood sugar level was at 28. Normal being around well under 5. And they left him for several months like that. And in the end, I went to our GP and I said, look, I'm sure there's something diabetic going on. So she gave me strips to test. And sure enough, I graphed out his blood test results, did it every day, graphed it out. And I actually took it back to by this time and said, these are his blood test results. How come you didn't notice, that it's running high? And he just didn't take me on at all.
David's liver continued to deteriorate.
Yes.
He was experiencing, again, continuing weight loss, itching, jaundice, lipodystrophy.
Yes.
And he was referred with a view to a liver transplant.
He was, yes. He was referred to St James's here in Leeds. He was referred to see Dr Davis, who was really brilliant. He was very good. He sat us down. He went in on the, can remember it, he went in on the 7th of May of 1999. And we sat down and we spent the week in Leeds while he underwent all the tests and everything to see if he was suitable as a recipient. And at the end of the week, he basically said, we've never done a transplant here for anyone who's got HIV as well as hepatitis C. And you'll have to have a HIV drug holiday after the transplant. But they were willing to take him on. And that was... Yeah, sorry.
Carry on.
They were willing to take him on to give him a liver transplant.
And you've said in your statement it was agreed he was dying of the liver disease and not the HIV.
Yeah, the HIV was under control by this time. His viral load was undetectable.
David had his transplant on the 8th of June 1999.
He did.
And you've said that medically the doctors did a really good job, but
Yes.
the nursing was
Awful.
not so understanding.
No. They just didn't pick up on things that... being a nurse, unfortunately, sometimes you can see things coming. And they just didn't pick up on... When he was even in intensive care, I could see ectopics on his ECG, and things weren't right, but I couldn't explain. And they sent me off to have a sleep for a couple of hours. And when I came back, he was on his way back to theatre with a bleed. So they'd not noticed that. And they were really reluctant to nurse him, if you see what I mean. They wouldn't help him have a wash or anything. And in the end, I just did all the nursing care myself. I used to go in at 6 in the morning, get him up, make sure he'd had a wash and everything, make sure he ate something during the day, got him outside if I could, although he was on tacrolimus by this time, which you can't really go out in sunlight. And then I'd stay with him till 11 o'clock at night, and then our caravan was parked in the middle of the park in Leeds at Roundhay. So I used to go back to the caravan, catch a bit of kit, and then go back again the next day. And it was about 3 weeks he was in.
And David had been put in a side ward on his own due to his HIV status, and the nurses didn't want to go near him.
No, they wouldn't go near him. I did his dressings, I did his obs, I did everything. It's quite funny actually, because he was the only one that didn't get MRSA. So there was some irony to it all.
And as you've said, he ended up going back to theatre because he was bleeding.
Yeah, and then he went back again after that.
Because his bowel was blocked.
Yeah.
He was suffering from hypothermia. He was hallucinating.
Oh yes, he was he was away with the fairies. He could see Labrador dogs sitting on the opposite bed, and yeah, it was.
He was discharged home, but by this time he was down to about 7.5 stone.
Yeah,
And he'd been a big man.
yeah, he was 15 stone at his fighting weight.
And then he had to have a stent put in his bile duct.
Yes, yeah, the anastomosis where they joined the bile duct together sort of collapsed on itself, so they did an endoscopy, and that's not without risk, and put a stent across to open the bile duct up so that the bile could flow then, because he'd gone jaundiced again.
And then in late 1998, you say his HIV reared its head.
Yes.
He had hepatic ulcers and had to be put on medication for that.
Yes, yeah. The other thing that I've only found out recently, I don't know whether I put it in my statement actually, was I got some medical records from North Manchester General, and it turns out that the liver that he got, and if he hadn't had that liver, he wouldn't have had those 6 months, and I appreciate that, but it was cytomegalovirus risk. So he had an extra drug added, so he had to have ganciclovir as well as all his other drugs and the anti-rejection drugs and everything else. So he'd got quite a cocktail, and we think that's what had tipped the HIV.
And physically, he continued to deteriorate. You
Yes.
said that by the end of 1999, the hepatitis C was rearing
back.
its head again.
Yeah, that had come back. He was jaundiced, he'd lost more weight. There's a photograph of him on New Year's Eve, 1999. And he looks like he's just walked out of Auschwitz, except that he's orange. He's that badly jaundiced.
And he was so ill by this time that doctors and nurses had to come to the house
Yes.
to run tests there. He
Yeah,
couldn't get
he
to
couldn't.
hospital.
No, he couldn't get. We couldn't get to Leeds. There was no way we could have got down the M62.
There was a discussion about the possibility of a further liver transplant.
Yes, and they talked about another liver transplant, but there's almost like a conference call before conference calls happened. Our GP was sat at our house, and he'd spoken with Dr. Mandel, and actually it was Dr. Schmidt by this time, and he'd spoken with Dr. Davis in Leeds, Dr. Schmidt at North Manchester General, and they'd come to the conclusion that they would give him another liver transplant. But David said that he'd had enough, and he couldn't go on anymore. He couldn't have another transplant because he just couldn't go through that anymore.
He just wanted them to leave him alone.
Yeah. That was on the Thursday.
What happened over the weekend?
He stopped taking all his medication. He was up and about, just couldn't get downstairs very well. He came downstairs on the Sunday, wasn't eating. He went back up Sunday dinner time, and he got up a couple of times in the afternoon just to go to the loo and back, and then at 2 o'clock in the morning I had to ring the GP because he was in so much pain. And the GP came out and he said, the GP had given me his phone number, his home phone number to ring him, and he said, the only thing I can give him is morphine, and we both know that that's the beginning of the end. And it's 8 o'clock in the morning, he passed away with me and the boys in the room.
And how old was David at the time of his death?
He was just 40.
And those years between his diagnosis and his death, how had they been for David?
Awful, absolutely horrendous. He'd had we tried to do everything we could to give the boys good memories of him. Every time we went away, we tried to go away. We went in a caravan, so we were. In the end, I towed the caravan and set it up and everything, so that we could get away just for a few days. Every time we went, we made scrapbooks. We saved tickets. We kept everything so that he would still be there. Tried to pick out the good things that happened and not dwell on the horrible things. And I personally made some horrendous mistakes. I didn't tell the children that he was dying. I didn't know how to. Nobody came up with a magic recipe of, this is a speech to have with your children, And we couldn't tell them because it was HIV and it was hepatitis. And if the school had found out, then, some horrendous stories of children being excluded from schools and, they had enough problems in their lives without anything else that, they both... And they were trying to forge their... And I made mistakes.
David had died at home.
Yeah.
And there was due to be a coroner's inquest into his death.
There was. The GP said that, from what he'd read, he knew as well, he wanted a coroner's inquest because it needed to be out in the open what had happened. My first thought was, oh my God, the press will be there. Stranger things you think. So we did have a coroner's inquest, but because there was a coroner's inquest, I had 2 burly policemen parked on my door. I had to identify his body formally, and then they came and took him away.
The inquest conclusion was that he died of liver failure.
Yeah.
Hepatitis C diagnosis was recorded, secondary to and then HIV infection.
Yeah.
And a verdict of misadventure.
Yes.
You've touched on the impact that the medication David had on his mood and his behaviour. How overall did that impact upon you and the children?
I tried to minimise it for the children as best I could. I think our eldest lad got more flack. Sometimes you end up referee, in the middle. I'm sorry, I've lost my mind again.
But the David who behaved like that was the David who behaved like that because of his medication.
Absolutely.
And not because that was the man he was
No.
or the father that he was.
No, not at all.
You had a nervous breakdown after his
Yes.
death in late 2000. What, if anything, would you like to tell us about that?
When he died, everything stopped. You've been so busy. I still have the children, and thank the Lord I did, because I wouldn't be here if I hadn't had them. All the caring stops, and you feel like you've got no purpose anymore. And then I got to the point where I couldn't read, I couldn't write, I couldn't string a sentence together. I was treated at a psychiatric hospital. I used to go once a week, and my task was to colour a picture and to actually have the concentration to colour a child's picture was just hard, really hard.
So you'd given up work to care.
I gave up
For
work in
David.
1992.
And pretty much since 1992, you'd been isolated in terms
Yeah.
of social life and other interactions.
Yeah, I couldn't go out. I couldn't leave him at all.
You said in your statement, David never got to see his sons grow up,
No,
to get degrees.
no,
He never got to see them marry,
no,
and he never got to hold his grandchildren.
no.
You were left as a widow looking after 2 boys, and you were very substantially in debt.
Yeah, significantly.
You've been left, you've explained in your statement, with ongoing mental health problems in terms of depression,
Yeah,
and you continue to take antidepressants.
yes, yeah. I have to be quite careful. You get used to the symptoms after a while, and you know when things are going a bit pear-shaped.
You've remarried, and your husband is extremely supportive.
Very.
And you've said that if it wasn't for him, you don't think you'd be alive now.
No, about 5 years ago, I had another breakdown, and that was work-related. I'd just lost my mother. I died at home, and we nursed her, and when I went back, they weren't very sympathetic, and everything just went downhill from there. I ended up being performance managed. When you're being performance managed, it's all right as long as the goalposts stay in one place, but they kept moving them. And in the end, I took ill health retirement. But because I'd had so much time off looking after David, my pension is nothing.
David had been involved in the 1991 litigation.
Yes,
And you've recorded in your statement that he had to sign a waiver, and it was very much take it or leave it.
yes. It was take it or leave it, and not only that, but if you don't sign it, then nobody gets anything.
What was yours and David's experiences of the trusts and schemes?
The McFarlane Trust were a nightmare. You needed reams and reams of evidence to extract anything out of them. I do remember when David died, Anne Hithersay was the, I don't know whether she was the director or something. She was very nice. In fact, her letter saved my skin not that long ago. She sent me a lovely letter after David died saying, enclosing the funeral grant, which was £1,000 then. And that letter I had to use for EIBSS because somewhere along the line from David dying in 2000, I received money from them until 2002 when I went back to work. So I was given a sort of monthly income until I got my number back, because by then my number had lapsed and I had to retrain as a nurse. But once I was back working, then everything stopped. And they, basically at that point, they must have thrown my file in the bin, because when EIBSS was invented, nothing was transferred. So I knew nothing about the EIBSS money that had been given to widows. I didn't even know anything about it. And when I had to fill the form in for that and produce all the evidence, you know, his will, his death certificate, and everything else, they wanted proof that I was living with him when he died. And they suggested perhaps bank statements might be useful. I don't know anybody who keeps bank statements for 19 years. So I was really, really struggling because they weren't going to pay the 10,000, they weren't going to pay it out until I happened to speak to Victoria Prowse, who was winding up the McFarlane Trust, and I said, have you got anything in my file? And she sent me a letter that the letter that Anne Hithersley had written, and that was the only thing I've got that says that I cohabited with David.
And you've described overall your experience of dealing with the schemes as jumping through hoops and to fight
absolutely.
for everything.
You fought for everything. I mean, you know, I remember once applying for a washing machine, and they said, what do you want one for? I thought I'd grow flowers in it, you know. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And you needed the medical form. Some medical forms have come back with some of the notes from North Manchester General, and the form that they actually filled in is in the case notes. You know, it's just crazy. You know.
Now, a couple of years after David died, you and some other widows
Yes.
of haemophiliacs who had been infected with HIV and who had died made a complaint about the treatment
Yes.
that they had received at Manchester Royal Infirmary.
Yes.
You've touched on a number of your concerns about the overall care at Manchester Royal Infirmary, and it's right, I should say, that the documents you've given us also contain Manchester Royal Infirmary's response. But you had a particular concern, you and others in your position,
Yes.
about what had been the behaviour of a nurse counsellor
Yes.
called Meg Openshaw.
Yes.
And can you just give us a flavour of what the concerns were?
David and I, with a few others, had been to the weekends that Richard was talking about, and we'd found this group called the Birchgrove Group, and they were amazing. And so we decided that it would be a really good idea to have something similar to that in Manchester. So we approached the nurse counsellor because she was the one that knew everybody, if she would help us with it, which she gladly did. Anyway, it came down to later on that as she was going round doing her counselling, she was taking tidbits from one person to the next. So, for example, if I got a washing machine, she'd tell everybody else that I'd had a washing machine and how I'd got it and what I'd done. There were some horrendous things that she divulged so much personal, very, very personal information.
Such as HIV status?
Oh, yes, yeah. HIV status of a widow, not a widow, a wife had been divulged to everybody who would listen. She claimed that one of the wives who was HIV positive had been raped by her husband. She was just obnoxious, horrendous.
And the complaints that were made by, it was you and four other
Yes.
families, were of breaches of confidentiality, and that was in particular your concern, but also inappropriate treatment or lack of treatment and unprofessional conduct,
Yes,
specifically towards this group of haemophiliacs who had HIV.
yes,
And without going into the detail of the documentation, because you've supplied it all to the inquiry, you and the others made a complaint to the McFarlane Trust, or
Yes.
asked the McFarlane Trust to investigate the complaints.
yeah. The McFarlane Trust and the Haemophilia Society were there at that meeting, and we'd raised concerns, so they got us all together, and they. Anne Hithersley was there, and she put together the report, which then went to the chief exec.
And it ultimately went to Manchester Royal Infirmary.
Yep.
And you said in your statement that you're not really clear what happened to it after that.
No, the last I heard, this matron contacted me, whom I met, and who said, there, dear, you know, it's just a complete whitewash. They had no intention of taking it any further. And I got a letter. She said, put your questions in a letter, which I did. And I got a response back from one of the consultants that was basically, you know, he didn't answer my questions.
Ms. Key, those are the questions I have for you. Is there anything you would like to add?
Yes, that's all right. Just need my glasses now. I'd like to say thank you to those who've helped us on this long and horrendously difficult journey. My dad, he was the first to know about David's infection and wanted to sell everything, his business and everything, to obtain whatever treatment there was for him. David's brother, who would draw cartoons for him and who spent many hours talking to him, driving me and the children to and from a variety of hospitals. Sadly, neither of these wonderful men lived to see us get this far. My husband and 2 boys, their wives, our wonderful grandchildren, and the rest of our family who have steadfastly supported us through the dark times. Self-help groups, and more recently for me, Tainted Blood and Factor 8, Colin Solicitors, Sir Brian and the inquiry team. There were some clinicians who were shining stars. Dr Azawi, who was swimming against a tide of apathy at Manchester Royal Infirmary, Dr John McClendon, hepatologist, Dr Bibat Mandel, Dr Bridget Mayer and Dr Schmidt from North Manchester General, Dr Davis and his team here at St James's. They gave him a chance of life with a liver transplant. And I want to thank the donor and their family. I'd like to thank our GPs obtaining the interferon treatment when MRI wouldn't pay, the district nurses who helped after David's transplant and at the time of his death, and the psychiatric nurse who latterly helped me back from the edge. During our journey, we've met some diabolical clinicians, and I include nurses. Some who didn't understand and were afraid of the viruses our loved ones had been given. Some incompetent. Some who downright lied, hid and are still hiding evidence, kept us isolated, alone and ignorant, and were prepared to let our loved ones die. Please, Sir Brian, with your team at your side, uncover the facts, the omissions, the lies and the greed. Leave no stone unturned and let us understand the whole truth of why and how this tragedy happened.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask Mr Snowden if there's anything further.
Okay.
No, there isn't. Thank you.
Okay,
Sir
thank you.
Brian?
Thank you very much indeed, Miss Q. That's it for you for today, even though you go on living with what you've told us about. So thank you for telling us.
Thank you.
Now we have a 10:30 start tomorrow, do we?
We do, sir.
And what do we have tomorrow?
We are hearing from Peter Burney and from Anne, Sarah, Eleanor and Jennifer Doricott.
Thank you. So 10:30 tomorrow. Thank you all.